Hey there. So just finished watching part two of Picard's final two-part episode in Arcadia Ego as part of my series where I'm going through every episode of Picard season one and talking about each episode. It's kind of funny as I was getting started watching this episode or watching part two here. As I was getting started, I looked at the seek bar, the thing, whatever you call it, that has the number of minutes on it. And I thought to myself when I saw it, I'm like, man, I thought there had to be a lot of stuff crammed in this episode because I looked at it and it's a 55-minute episode. And I'm like, yeah, that kind of makes sense because for the last, I don't know, last two or three episodes I watched, I kept thinking to myself, it just wasn't stacking up how much stuff I remembered that I knew had to happen before the season was over. And it seemed like there was just too much stuff for how few episodes were left. And now I come to this one and I'm like, okay, well, this makes sense. Turns out they just managed to wrap up a lot in a single episode or a single 55-minute episode. Um, so as I was kind of getting my thoughts together, I decided pretty early on, there's so much stuff to talk about in this episode. I decided to split up my discussion into two parts. So for this video, I'm just going to be talking about this episode, part two here, up to the part where Picard passes out on board the La Sirena. And then I'm going to make another video talking about the rest of the episode after that point, which actually isn't that many minutes of the episode. I think it's about 15 minutes of the episode, but there's a lot in there. So I'm going to make a whole another video about that, which is probably going to be a longer video than this one from what my notes are looking like right now. So for in Arcadia Part Two, what happens in this episode? Well, we pick up where we left off last episode, and then we get a bunch of interesting dialogue between Soji and captive Picard in his captive room. Because remember, he just got put under. I think they called it house arrest. It's not his house, but he's stuck in there. And so then we get some dialogue where Soji comes in, and we have a little bit of this moral dialogue about, okay, Soji, what on earth do you think you're doing? Then we get some interesting dialogue between Elnor and Seven on board the Borg cube, what it means to be alive. We get some little moments between Narek and Narissa as they kind of have this secret meeting as they try to get their wits together, you know. Um, and then Narek goes over to the La Serena to end up teaming up with the good guys so they can all try to sneak into the camp and try to sabotage the beacon. We get the part where Seven ends up killing Narissa, throwing her down just like the Emperor. The Emperor went down the pit, and that's where Narissa went, you know. Um, and we get the part where Soong finds out who really killed Saka. That's a pretty important bit there. And then, of course, he's on the team of the good guys after he finds that out. Then the Romulan fleet arrives, ready to exterminate the whole planet. But now that Sutra has been deactivated by Soong with Soong's super cool remote control off switch, that little thing he pulled out, and there she goes. After everything that happened to the next generation with the lore, you kind of have this fear that once this android is out of control, there's no way to deactivate her. But Soong just pulled that thing out and pushes a button, and down she goes. Pretty as you please. So anyway, with Sutra out of the way, it kind of just ends up with Soji being in charge, kind of de facto, or at least she's the one standing in front of the controls. However, that ends up happening. I guess she's the one with the assertiveness and the will, to take charge. And everyone else is just kind of like, they're just these androids that never have anything like this happen to them. And they're just like, oh, what to do. So anyway, then Picard and Jurati over on the La Serena decide to power up the ship and fly out toward the Romulans and try to save the day some old way. And they manage to save the day because Picard convinces Soji to accept his life instead of the lives of the whole human race or the whole alien race throughout the galaxy. And then once the Federation fleet has arrived, then Soji shuts off the beacon and closes the portal right when all the tentacle monsters start coming through. Man, those tentacle critters look mean. Dr. Octopus can't hold a candle to them. But unfortunately, after all that, Picard is not well, and he's about to die, especially after he got Jurati to give him that some kind of crazy powerful stimulant to keep him going so he could talk to Soji back when he was about to pass out, but he still needed to convince Soji not to destroy the universe, destroy the galaxy, I should say. And then right here at the end, we get a couple picturesque, quiet moments after all the action has died off, and we're in the after the climax, we're in the calming, action falling off point, and we get a couple picturesque quiet moments where we see 7 of 9 and Rios sharing their regrets and sharing a bottle. And then we see Eleanor and Raffi just sharing a good old cry together. And then after that, the stuff after that point is going to be the stuff that I'll talk about in the next video about Data and the new synth body for Picard and all the concluding bits of the season and that kind of stuff. But I think there's more than enough for me to talk about in the rest of the episode. All right, so that's the summary. Now let's rewind to the beginning and just kind of go through and talk about some interesting talking points. I'm not going to talk about every scene. I'm just kind of the ones that stood out to me so that after I watched it and I kind of put my thoughts together and just kind of barfed them out onto my phone, or I forget if I put it on my phone or my laptop, but I barfed them out and then I turned them into what I'm going to share with you now. Just kind of some highlights and some interesting talking points. And the first bit there, just near the beginning of the episode, there was that little discussion between Seven and Eleanor on the Borg cube about death and suicide. Pretty heavy stuff, but it's interesting stuff. It's interesting because it fits into the existential themes that go throughout the season. And here, near the end of the season, they kind of drop the great big existential question to rule them all. You got all the rings to rule them all, and here's the great existential question to rule them all. And Eleanor drops it to Seven. It's the question of why on earth we would want to keep on living at all. Eleanor specifically asks, he's kind of looking out at all the confused and aimless XBs wandering around, and he's kind of pondering whether the XBs should keep living since they don't have, and I'll just read I copied out the quote here. Eleanor says, would the XBs be better off dead? Everyone hates them, they have no home, they don't belong anywhere. And then Seven looks at him with a little smile and says, am I better off dead? I'm an XB, I have no home, I don't belong anywhere. Why don't I just put a phaser to my head and get it over with? And Eleanor says, because I miss you. And that's the end of the little sequence. And it's so short and so, it's kind of said in a lighthearted way. Of course, the subject matter is not lighthearted at all. Now, you could suggest that there's 2 topics going on at the same time here. On the one hand, from an existential standpoint, it's kind of the question of what does it mean to be living? What's the point of life? What's the meaning of life? And then, on the other hand, kind of on a more practical standpoint, there's definitely the quite literal question of what keeps somebody from committing suicide when it feels like, in terms of your feelings and your experiential, experience, it feels like there's nothing to live for, no good reason to stay alive. And I think Seven's response to Eleanor maybe suggests that, for Seven at least, the core parts of her humanness or her reason to live, the core part of that, it's not having a home, belonging somewhere, or being appreciated by others versus being hated. That's not the core of it. So as she sees it, the XBs are not any less human or less worth keeping alive because of their lack of these things, their lack of having a home, belonging somewhere, or being appreciated by others. But they may feel like they are less human and less worth being around. They may feel less like individuals or less like persons for lacking all those things. And just kind of thinking about, when you think about all the years that Seven experienced back on Voyager, think about the impact that Janeway and Voyager had on Seven. I think Seven and Janeway would probably agree that an extremely important part of our human experience, us as individuals and being human, being individuals, a big part of that is actually found in our sense of belonging and home and community. And in particular, is found in how we exist, the fact that we exist in relation to others, which kind of makes sense because often when people feel displaced, unwanted, and without purpose, without social belonging, it's not unusual for somebody to feel some kind of impulse in this kind of suicidal direction. Of course, there are a lot of other things that could push someone in that direction, such as clinical depression, psychological trauma, certainly extremely big life problems that seem insurmountable. But But when somebody is in that kind of place, what could somebody tell himself or herself to answer the question of whether you should stay alive, why you should stay alive, what's the point of being around? And Elnor answered the question by providing a variation of one of the more common answers. The way he puts it is, because I would miss you. Of course, this isn't necessarily supposed to be the final or the best answer to the question. I think the point of the scene is simply to ask the question, but in his little answer there, we kind of get one little sliver of a class of answers, which is because for many people, one of the most compelling arguments that they can muster for why they will stay alive, after all, why they will, after all, stay alive. For many people, one of the most compelling arguments for that has to do with other people in their lives. Because we as humans, as individuals, as persons, we exist in relation to one another. A similar kind of aspect is just the often repeated observation that you might hear that a death, especially a death by suicide, it often ends up having more of an impact on other people, such as your family, than you would have thought beforehand. That's just kind of one of those things in life. So Elnor's kind of instinctive answer that he just kind of instinctively, reflexively throws out there, his answer to the suicide question, the hypothetical suicide question, his answer is basically, don't kill yourself because I want you around. You could say from a more kind of impersonal bird's eye view kind of standpoint, you could say maybe the scene here is kind of implying for us part of the value of an individual life is just the fact that and how each life inevitably interweaves with those lives around it. Which does kind of take us full circle, takes us back to Elnor's suggestion that started the discussion. Elnor's kind of suggestion that there's a correlation between social context and whether or not it's worth it to be alive. Because remember, Elnor basically suggested that it's worth being alive if you have a home and you belong somewhere and you're not hated. That was, I'm kind of flipping what Elnor said and saying the positive side. Similarly, the first thing that pops in his head for why Seven shouldn't kill herself is also ends up being a distinctly social kind of thing. Seven shouldn't kill herself because of her social value to people like Elnor. So perhaps Elnor and Seven, as this discussion is going, kind of the between the lines thought that they would probably both be having is that the XBs, far from being in a place where they ought to kill themselves, they have social value to one another and to people like Picard and Soji and Seven and Elnor who value them. And that's plenty good enough reason for them to stick around. But this can certainly cause us to kind of back up further and ask the more kind of bird's eye view, more philosophical question of, does a person continue to hold personhood if he doesn't exist in relation to others to a significant extent? If he has no community, no connections, and no social interactions, and no goal or purpose to do that relates to other people, is he still a person? Is he still real and alive, existentially speaking? Do we define someone's personhood as that which is intrinsic to conscious existence? Or do we define someone's personhood in some way that is in relation to their functioning within the world among other people? That you in some way might gain personhood once people see your face now and again, once people have memories about you, once people have some desire to meet up with you for coffee and ask you about the latest gossip. The question is kind of like, what's the sine qua non of a person or of a meaningful life or of living, being alive? And since I love my Star Trek cross-referencing habits, I have to take my cross-reference trail and point out that this topic kind of intersects with good old Voyager Season 2, Episode Tuvix, because the ethical dilemma in the episode Tuvix was the situation where all three characters, we had Tuvok and Neelix and then Tuvix, all three of them were living people, biologically speaking, but Tuvok and Neelix had social connections and histories and people who cared about them, like Kes. They had lives. But Tuvix didn't have any of those. He only had life, but he didn't have a life yet. And now here with Elnor and the XBs, as Elnor was looking out at all these wounded people wandering around who have life, technically, but not a life. And as he looks out at them and sees them, he's just kind of wondering, is it worth it to keep existing without these so important things that seem so essential to being an individual, being a person, so essential to human living? Incidentally, it draws my mind back to earlier in Picard season 1, when Jean-Luc, every time I say Picard, I feel like I'm just going Picard, 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 because it's, the name of the series. So why don't I just call him Jean-Luc? Or I could go with JL. I really hate the initials JL. I think it doesn't fit. I love everything about Picard season 1, but I don't like the fact that they decided to have Raffi call him JL all the time. Anyway, let me get back on track. Yes. So early on, remember when Picard said, I haven't been living. He said it in kind of an angry way. I haven't been living, I've been waiting to die, because this was right before, he's getting ready to go. And Laris and Jaban are telling him, don't go. You're gonna, you're risking this and that, you're risking your life, really. But his response is, I haven't been living, And so this whole talk about what it means to be the kind of being that is worth being alive, it kind of draws my mind back there. It's not quite the same situation, but it's similar just in the sense that we're talking about our felt degree of being alive based on what is going on in our lives. And no doubt Picard, back when he was on the Vineyard and he's just kind of going day by day, no doubt he occasionally had suicidal thoughts during that whole period of his life in which he was living there on the Vineyard, not accomplishing a whole lot, not having much of anything to live for, and having a lot of painful memories and disillusionment and disappointments and stuff like that in his mind. So he almost certainly had some suicidal thoughts, and probably some of the lines of reasoning that kept those suicidal thoughts at bay was probably just the fact that that he had Laris and Jaban, and then to quote to partially quote Elnor, Laris and Jaban would miss him. It's such a kind of simplistic use of language there. Elnor kind of says it like a child. I would miss you, but there's some meaning to that. Picard, when those thoughts would come, could probably say, you know what? I don't want Laris and Jaban to find the body. I don't want to do that to them because I know they care about me, and I don't want to create that. I don't want to create that, because these social connections, the interweaving of lives, this is part of our humanness, and it matters. And for someone like Picard, for any one of us, we recognize that we continue to exist in this connected thing, and you can't just disappear and think that nothing's going to happen, think that it's just not going to matter. So anyway, he probably continued to stay alive, partly because of the parts of his life, and the social part is one of those parts, but the parts of his life that still continued to exist as a life. He had a life. But his misery and his existential angst that he had were in large part because of the extent to which he didn't have a life. I mean, in a real sense, you look at what he was doing day by day, he didn't have a life. So yeah, with season 1's very much preoccupation or a thematic focus on existentialism and the nature of life and death and meaning and human choice in the midst of all that else, I think this nice little tiny conversation between Seven and Elnor is a wonderfully appropriate, very Star Trek-ish talking point, because Star Trek is all about philosophy and thinking and you know, the heavy stuff, the thought-provoking stuff. It's a wonderful little bit here to invite the watcher to begin thinking about questions of the meaning of life and the difference between living and dying, which are definitely as well going to continue being talked about as the episode moves forward, and definitely are just, you know, throughout the whole season. That's kind of in the background every moment. It should be noted that this isn't a complete discussion. You know, the little bit that Seven and Eleanor have, it's more of a conversation starter, in the sense that everybody's reasons for continuing to live in the face of suicidal thoughts, everyone's reasons are going to be different. Everyone's answer as well to the existential question of why it's meaningful to be alive, or to be a human or a person. Everyone's answer to that is going to be a little different too. I think it's important to note that the loss of certain important social aspects of life is often a big motivator for suicide. That's a lot of the time what gets people going down that path. And for those who believe that human life is inherently valuable for intrinsic reasons, regardless of your connection to others, it might seem a little disconcerting to see personhood or the value of life defined by anything that's not just intrinsic to human life, you know. But defining worth in relation to others is certainly a significant improvement over defining it in relation to, let's say, how much pleasure you have, how many goals you're able to meet, how many things you get out of life. Because a lot of the time, that's where we end up defaulting to. We say, if I'm feeling good, if I'm happy, then it's worth being alive. You could suggest there's kind of a three-part succession in terms of how likely a reason for being alive, how likely that reason is to end up getting snuffed out when life gets tough. And I've got three things here. First one would be the self-oriented goals related to accomplishment, pleasure, happiness, that kind of thing. This is very easy to lose. And if that's your reason to live, then you're pretty likely to find yourself with no reason to live and a meaningless life, seemingly, at some point in your life. So that one. And then second, the social or communal aspects related to being there for others rather than about yourself. In the sense that being there for others, in the sense that you can't not exist in relation to others. You can't not influence other people's well-being through your living or dying. So for this one, the priority is not in having or getting or experiencing, but instead it's about giving and participating and sharing reality, even if only in a faltering way. So this one is much more difficult to lose as a reason to live. But certainly in tragic situations, many people have found themselves in a state of, let's say, total rejection, social rejection, or other situations that could overturn that desire to live. So we had the first one, the more kind of pleasure, self-oriented goals and plans and, you know, that kind of thing. It's good for me to stay alive because I want to go do this thing and experience this and be happy, you know. And the second one being the more social, interrelational. It's about giving. It's about being with others and being part of, you know, that kind of thing. But then thirdly would be something that's more intrinsic in nature, maybe a moral, spiritual, or existential in nature, that relates to the idea, in some sense, that just by virtue of being human and being alive, you have an intrinsic value or worth or sacredness that isn't contingent on any situational aspect at all. And in this kind of perspective, this kind of reason for living, this is where you would say the act of putting out a brilliant candle is unthinkable, and it's not an option. To paraphrase what Sung said to Girardi about Maddox, the candle, and candles are often used artistically and poetically to refer to a human life. Because just like you blow out a candle, you know, you hold it up and out it goes, and there's nothing but just the smoke. That's human lives. You know, we live and the flame goes, and we die, and one little breath and we're gone. So a candle or a flame is a very accurate and very artistic metaphor for life. Anyway, so for this third way of seeing it, it could be related to, is often related to somebody's religious or spiritual beliefs, whether about God or self or the afterlife. The afterlife can be a big part, just in regard to the topic of suicide. Or this could instead just be related to very strong moral convictions about the nature of a human person. Somebody who doesn't believe in God or the afterlife, but does believe in a non-spiritual category, that the human person is of a moral value that we could throw the word sacred into, even though you don't technically believe in the sacred in the religious sense. So while somebody who has their reason to live in number 3 here instead of 1 or 2, the person would still be appealing to motivations in categories 1 and 2. So when you're feeling the call to suicide, you'd probably be reminding yourself, hey, I still want to go to, let's say, Paris or wherever you want to go. I still want to, I've never done such and such. I want to write that book, and because I haven't written that book yet, I'm going to stay alive. You still appeal to categories 1 and 2. You still say, there are people who know me, and when I picture so and so crying about my death, that motivates me. So you're still going to appeal to categories 1 and 2 to give you emotional motivation to live life and live it well. But in category 3, no matter what happens to 1 and 2, suicide will never be seen as a helpful or worthwhile consideration. It's definitely the case that many people find their strongest reasons to continue living within the religious/spiritual domain. And that doesn't mean that you ought to be religious or spiritual. It doesn't mean that religious ideas are true. But it has been argued that within this kind of religious spiritual domain, people who find their reasons to live in that area, often that category is the least susceptible to being dislodged as a reason to live when life gives you lemons, lemons that reek. Doesn't mean that somebody with that kind of reasoning won't kill themselves, but such a person will be less likely to come to believe that ending his life by suicide would actually be more worthwhile than the alternative. Be less likely to be able to rationally say that I have become convinced that this is a legitimate option that might turn out better than not doing it. That makes sense. But anyway, enough of all this dark stuff. Talk of death and suicide and hanging on for 1 minute longer when you don't want to. Let's come up for air and talk about pleasant Star Trek. Let's talk about warp nacelles and tricorders that chirp, and silly little purple gadgets that look like ocarinas and can fix broken ships with little energy effects. Okay, well, we'll get to that later. We'll get to little ocarina gadgets later. But first, let's go moving forward a little bit into the episode. Unfortunately, everything I noticed in this episode is kind of on the dark side, so this whole discussion is going to be fairly dark until we get to the ocarina bit, and then I can just say how much I don't like it. So, it's just nothing positive. I'm feeling very negative today. Hope I don't pull you down too far, my negativity. Anyway, moving forward a little bit into the episode, it's an interesting plot element to have Narek, nasty old Narek, joining with the good guys in the effort to save the galaxy. Because usually we associate heroism, or the desire to save others. Narek's like, yeah, let's go save the galaxy. Usually we associate heroism or the desire to save others as something connected with moral character, and something that's kind of the opposite of the kind of heartless, abusive person we've come to see in Narek. But when the stakes are high, anybody would try to protect the galaxy. His motivation could be seen as heroism, or it could be seen as heroism, or it could be seen as self-protectiveness, since he and everything he values with the Jabach and all that and everything else he values, about selfish ambition, most likely, but, everything he values would be killed out, wiped out along with the rest of the galaxy if Gamadan occurs. And in a similar vein, we should remember that the organization Narek is part of, the Zhat Vash, has always been ostensibly about saving the galaxy. I think it's important just in general that we once in a while remind ourselves that even those who build their life around selfish and destructive goals and habits, abusers and quote unquote evil individuals like Narek and Narissa, that such people can often engage in behaviors that are indistinguishable from benevolence and heroism, can seem almost indistinguishable from being truly pro-social, selfless, and truly motivated by the well-being of others. In the case of Narek and the Zhat Vash, I think it'd be fair to say that the Zhat Vash narrative has always been that they are on the side of the good, in the sense of seeking the benefit of humanity, or alienity, if you prefer, since they are humans. But the benefit of the galaxy, the benefit of us conscious, sentient people, which in Star Trek includes Klingons and Cardassians, and hey, these guys are even trying to save the founders and the Jem'Hadar. The narrative has always been that they're on the side of the good, in the sense of doing what is right, as they see it. Hence, one of the reasons why Narissa always refers to Soji as a thing or an abomination, rather than calling her by her name, because even with all of Narissa's inner twistedness, like she has very much twisted her sense of morality and her, ability to, intuit what is right, the way she treated Hugh, for example. She's a twisted person, but even with all her twistedness, there's still a narrative to be followed that leaves the Zhat Vash mission as morally superior and completely right. And presumably everything that she does, including what she did to Hugh, is justified because of the greater narrative and fighting for everything that's right as they see it. It's so easy to make evil. It's so easy to make evil into something that's unrelatable, out there somewhere, instead of something that's quite relatable. That those who do heinous acts, like Narissa and Narek, they're just the same as the rest of us, except that they've slowly, over time, become accustomed to beliefs and habits and attitudes that result in evil actions, that involve evil actions and irreversible harm on others and the world and themselves, certainly. And even the worst of such people have often got some highly personally compelling narratives that they've developed in order to excuse or even to praise their behavior, their evil behavior, as morally appropriate. And then here in this episode, then we see Narek actually fighting heroically to save the galaxy, arm in arm with our protagonists. And none of this makes Narek or Narissa innocent or morally ambiguous. Not even an inch of moral ambiguity. But it does make them understandable and relatable. And most importantly, just as human as the rest of us. And in a sense, just the same as me and you and all the rest of us. One of the bizarre moments that I noticed this time around was at the part where they went into the village and they got the bomb, and then they get caught. So they're trying to stop the synths from launching the beacon. And then they get caught, and Soji catches the bomb. And then Narek, the guys grab Narek, and he's on the ground, and he's just shouting at Soji, "Don't do it, Soji!" And I thought it was just so insane. Like I didn't laugh out loud literally, but I could have laughed out loud because I was just thinking in my head like, Narek, shut up! What are you, an idiot? It's like somebody should have been there to just walk up to him and slap him in the face and say, Narek, shut up. Do you want her to save us or not? I guess if the tension was lower, maybe, and if he was his normal wily self, he probably would have known better, I guess. He would have known that whatever he says, she's going to have good reason to feel instinctively and intuitively that whatever he says, she's better do the opposite. But I guess he's just so twisted and confused, as a person living this life he's living. I guess he's just so twisted and confused that when the intensity and the stakes get high and the tension is in the air, I guess he just kind of forgets which lie goes where. And so he uses his same old, murderous voice that you shouldn't trust. He uses that same old voice to say words that he should have known would make her all the more determined to destroy the galaxy. But man, I just couldn't believe how stupid Narek was in this scene. I guess he was just out of control. He's just like, Soji, don't do it, don't do it. It's like, you better just shut your mouth. You're not having the effect you're wanting to have here. But I guess while we're thinking about this kind of situation, it is a good opportunity to just notice that just because an evil person, quote unquote, or a liar, or an evil liar, just because an abusive, harmful person you can't trust, who has ill intent and that kind of thing. Just because such a person says something doesn't mean we need to disagree. And this is when life gets really, really messy and really, really confusing. And when it's hard to live, It's hard to live when you've got Narek screaming at you, saying something, and what he's saying is true and right. Because this is the one time when it would have been morally appropriate, and in terms of wisdom, it would have been wise. In a weird way, it would have been good for Soji to actually listen, in a sense. Well, a better way to put it would be, it would have been wise for her to actually consider the idea that Narek is currently expressing and think about doing what he's asking her to do, even though she's got very good reason to just by default automatically reject anything he says. Because just in general, the fact of the matter is, it's impossible for any one person to only ever say things that are untrue and unhelpful. Because, after all, somebody never going to say anything true or helpful by, happenstance. Of course, when you're in that kind of situation, it's a lot easier, often a lot better, to simply choose not to be in a place to hear any such words. It's going to do a lot better for your, trauma reactivity kind of thing. But in Soji's case, she's in the extremely painful situation of not having a choice in the matter. Now, moving on. Now here's where things get a little more lighthearted, just a little more negative. Because moving on, I'm going to start giving some mild criticisms. I think it's kind of funny when the Romulan ships show up. Just the way, because of the way they describe the scanning process, it's like, oh, there's a settlement, and they just know about it just like that. Their scanners pick it up, and it just sounds like it really gives you the impression that if they wanted, they could probably just target the settlement and blow it up in a couple of seconds. But it just keeps getting drawn out. And she's like, target, turn on the disrupt, sterilize the whole planet. That'll take a long time, and then those people will stay alive. So let's make it take a long time, I guess we can just exercise some suspension of disbelief and suggest that maybe they weren't close enough to the planet to do precision firing. Maybe they would have to fly closer. Or maybe these Romulan disruptors, maybe it's a special kind that takes like 5 minutes to target planets in particular. We'll say that's what it is. I don't know. But yeah, the scene is a little weird for that reason. The other weird part about this part of the episode is the whole part about Picard and Jurati using the little ocarina gadget with the 4 finger holes, or however many finger holes it has, to make all these virtual ships with warp signatures. The whole bit there just feels kind of corny. Like it's supposed to be funny, but it's not really funny at all. Particularly the part where Jurati is holding up the gadget and she's got a lot of weird smiles in that part that look like she's trying to be funny, but it's just not very funny. And the part where Picard's like, "You're sure they will have warp signatures?" And she's like, "Yep." And then he's like, "On my mark." And then Girardi like holds up the plastic toy in her fingers and makes all the ships come, you know. It just feels kind of so weird and silly and very much out of the mold of the way Star Trek handles things. And it does seem like it's supposed to be funny, but it's definitely, at least for my taste, not funny at all. And it's not because Star Trek doesn't have supernatural gadgets that are of a very small size. It's just the way it plays out, the way they did it. Because what I would expect, let's say on Voyager, because Voyager is what pops in my head the most, because that's what I watched the most as a preteen. But what I would expect in Voyager maybe would be they would have a little gadget. It probably wouldn't look like that because it needs to have some kind of flashing lights or something to make it look like it's not a toy. But it could be small. But you wouldn't just hold it up and randomly, for no reason, she knows all about it and she uses technobabble that doesn't sound like technobabble. It just sounds like fake technobabble. But anyway, it wouldn't happen like that. What would happen is B'Elanna would take it and she would slide it into this compartment that, you know, magically is the right size, because that kind of thing would tend to happen. And we wouldn't mind. And we also wouldn't mind that we didn't notice the compartment before. But the important part is that she's going to slide it in there. She's going to push buttons, because you got to push buttons. And then she's going to give us a technobabble description of what it is, because she has to find out. She doesn't just magically know and call it some kind of bogus, whatever it is that Girardi said. And then she would say, "And Captain, it might even have warp signatures." Instead of Girardi just being like, "Oh yeah, it'll have warp signatures. You bet it will. I don't know how I know that, but you bet." You know, B'Elanna would say, "You know, it might have warp signatures, especially if I tweak the gittle bliggle fliggle bloggle and I change the polarity." You know, and we would all be like, "Yeah, change the polarity." You know, we're on the edge of our seats because that's how things work in Star Trek. And then when they would use it, maybe you would see something coming out of a deflector dish, because, you know, that's legit. Or maybe you would just see something, you know, magically kind of, it's in its little niche that they put it in the ship, and you would just see it, you know, bursting out. But instead of all that, what they did to me, here I am getting all critical, acting like I hate Star Trek Picard, but the way this bit played out, it just kind of feels to me like it came out of a comic book made by kids for kids. You know, you just hold it up and you say, "This is fun." You know, hold up your little gadget. And I think that feeling is especially out of place for Picard, for Star Trek Picard, which for most of the season, for me, feels like it has more of a real life flavor than normal Star Trek does. So then suddenly out of the blue, we've got this scene here that feels like it came out of it feels like it was made by kids for kids, honestly. It feels like something that, you know, I would have put into a story when I was little and I would grow up, you know, and look at it and say, "Oh, that's kind of silly looking." You know, you can tell a kid wrote it, but this wasn't written by a kid, presumably. It just played out in a very kind of silly looking way. So I'm not a fan of that element, but that's okay. I don't have to like everything about Star Trek Picard. So, and then the Federation fleet shows up, and for whatever reason, the Romulans still don't go push some buttons real quick and blast the settlement to bits. Those warbirds must be sluggish. That must be what it is. They have very sluggish disruptor cannons. You know, maybe it's like loading a cannon in a pirate ship. You know, when you gotta load it up and you light the thing, and who knows, you know, maybe it's like the Romulans would have had to rev up some kind of really slow charge zapper cannons. I think there was something like that in some Star Trek game I played where you know, you have to hold down the button and it goes bzzz, and it loads up, and if you don't launch it fast enough, you might get killed while you wait. You know, maybe that's what it was. And they knew that they would have been charging up their zapper cannons, and then Riker would have blasted them to smithereens. Maybe that's got to be it. I think I figured it out right there. I also had a kind of funny thought this time around. In around that area, that part of the story. Remember the part where the tentacles were just starting to come through the portal, some nasty looking tentacles. And suddenly I just popped in my head. Because you know, like they said they were making a beacon, and then it turns out this isn't a beacon, it's opening a portal. And when those critters were getting ready to come through, this thought popped in my head. Hey, maybe these critters from another galaxy, maybe they just needed a portal, and it's all a lie. So they give this message to tell the synths that they're coming to help, but really it's a trick to get them to build a beacon, quote unquote, which is really a portal opener, because the monsters can't get to our galaxy without a little help. So they trick them to building a portal opener, and they come in with it and kill everybody, including the synths, and take over. Like some nasty Borg invasion. Species 8472, we're going to wipe out your galaxy. You know? I mean, why should you trust some murderous Dr. Octopus tentacles from another galaxy just because they say that they're keen on killing everybody except for you? That sounds kind of fishy to me. But Sutra believed them. Imagine if they came in and it turned out that arrogant old Sutra was being had the whole time. I want to see that version. So anyway, that's pretty much it for the rest of the episode. Basically, all I did for this video was talk about death and suicide, and then talk about how silly my least favorite parts of the episode were. I guess that's not a very good way to make a video. And there's a lot of stuff. There is a lot of stuff that I didn't talk about. I don't think this is one of the strongest episodes of the season, but I don't think it's terrible. There is a lot of good stuff that if I was going to make another video, I'm sure I would have plenty of, stuff to talk about. One important part of the Picard-Soji dialogue, when Picard's trying to convince Soji, and there's a lot of parts you could kind of analyze in how he's appealing to her and the psychological aspects there. I think one important part of that dialogue was the part where Picard points out that Soji isn't the destroyer after all, but in fact, it was up to her. And I thought that was kind of cool because it was kind of like we're back to the theme of free will, which fits in with the existential theme of the whole season. But also kind of like back in Nemesis, which is the last movie we had, before this, not including the 3 movies, But anyway, that discussion about the distinction between Picard and his genetic duplicate Shinzon. So when Picard says that, like, you weren't the destroyer after all, in the end, it was all along, it was up to you. It's kind of like Picard is taking those ideas that he experienced in Nemesis, that he experienced in a very personal way. The point where, he said to Data, is there really a difference between me and Shinzon? And Data said, well, you choose to better yourself. That's the difference. And it's almost like Picard is taking that and he's kind of plugging that in to his discussion with Soji. The idea that the distinction between Soji and the Destroyer is a distinction in terms of who she chooses to be. Which, of course, once again, is an existentialist theme, since free will is a big part of existentialism. We get into the situation and we see death and destruction are near, and your life is temporary. So now, in this moment, who are you going to choose to be? That's existentialism. Death and destruction are near, your life is temporary. So now, in this moment, who are you going to choose to be? And in this situation, she chose to be not the destroyer, contra the prophecy of Gamadan. And then there was also that scene where I'm sure I could talk a lot about the scene where Seven and Rios were talking about their regrets over a bottle of, Seven says, what passes for alcohol. And they both list things that they feel terrible about. Seven says throwing Narissa off the ledge, and she describes it something to the effect of killing somebody because, how did she put it? Because I didn't write this down. Killing somebody because it feels wrong for them to be alive. I think that's how she put it, which is kind of funny because it's not like it was premeditated. They were fighting, and Seven urgently had to get to the control panel to save some people. I forget what that was for, but it was urgent. And so, she just did a very in the moment choice to send Narissa flying. So it doesn't seem like she remembers it quite like it happened. But anyway, so Seven said that, and then Rios said what he regretted was what he felt terrible about was developing a positive connection with Picard, falling for another Starfleet captain, and then he dies. So basically we got the topic of killing and death and the topic of meaningful relationships and death. So once again, Picard season 1 is on its topics, if nothing else. Definitely, when you look at a season like this and you look at these themes and how consistently they are discussed, how consistently and intentionally and intelligently they are discussed, definitely, if you can't say anything else about Picard season 1, you can't say it's not very intentionally and intelligently created for thinking people and feeling people, for sure. The whole themes about empathy and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's all I got to say for now. I could definitely talk more about what kinds of interesting parts of the episode or topics that the episode suggests and alludes to. But I guess that's how it is with a lot of the episodes of Picard season 1. I had the very same thought with episode 1. I thought to myself, there's so many other things that I could talk about, but that's what happens when you decide to talk about one of your favorite. This is probably just for season 1, not so much for 2 and 3, certainly not for 3, but Picard season 1 is kind of like one of my favorite Star Trek series. Anyway, next video I'll pick up with the rest of the episode and the conclusion of the season. Picking up with the part right after Picard passes out aboard the La Serena and then he wakes up elsewhere. So, see you in the next one.